So let's start with the text. If we come over here and we say F5, look at that. So it creates a text box that you can type on. By changing the type to date, what does that do? Look at that. So you see how by changing the type attribute of the input, it actually changes how the element itself looks and how it actually functions. HTML tags or elements can have attributes. The purpose of attributes ranges from labeling an element to actually affecting how an element appears and functions on a browser. In this lesson, we will look into HTML tag attributes. Let's recap what we learned last time. HTML tags are the building blocks of HTML documents because all instructions are contained in these HTML tags. Now, typically an HTML element consists of an opening tag and a closing tag with the content of that element contained between those two tags. Some HTML components do not have a closing tag since they do not have content, so they just only consist of the opening tag, which is sometimes closed by placing the / before the closing bracket. In this lesson, we will look into HTML attributes and see the various roles they play in HTML elements. We will learn that HTML tag attributes are always placed on the opening tag of an element. Some attributes are used to identify a specific element or a group of elements. Some attributes affect how an element looks and functions when displayed on a browser. Some attributes are compulsory for some types of tags or elements, since those elements would not make sense without the compulsory attributes being used on them. And also a developer can even add custom attributes to attach or add extra information to an element. So let's head over to our source code editor and start seeing how attributes are actually written and see how they even influence how elements look and function on a browser. Alright, let's get into it. So we are going to learn about attributes. Remember, as we mentioned before, when you are creating an HTML element, you will have an opening tag, such as when we're creating this h1 element. So there's the opening tag. Then we put up the content of the element, HTML tag attributes, and then we close it off with a closing tag. So this then constitutes the h1 element consisting of the opening tag and the closing tag. Okay, I've saved it in a file called attributes.html. So the file is over here. We double click on it, and there it is. It opens on a browser. You can see I've opened the file before. So it opens on the browser, and there's our our h1 tag as displayed on the browser. So let's go back. Let's see. So now we want to learn about HTML tag attributes. So what does an attribute look like? Let's start off by looking at the first group of attributes that we spoke about, the attributes that are used to label or identify a specific element or a group of elements. Let's start with the first of these called an ID. So let's say we have a P element. Say I am the first paragraph. So in this P element, when we want to add an ID attribute to it, we come to the opening tag space, then we will say ID, which is the name of the attribute, is equal to, and then we could either use double quotes or single quotes. Either will work. I like using double quotes. So the ID is equal to, I would say first, it has to be, you shouldn't put spaces inside an ID attribute. Neither should you. There are a bunch of rules. For instance, you shouldn't start with a number. Start with a letter typically. So I'd say first paragraph. or as I like doing it, I say first underscore paragraph. So this is the typical format of an HTML tag attribute. It's the name of the attribute equals, and then inside quotations, you then specify the value of that attribute for this specific element. So this would be it. The ID attribute works in this way. Each element can have, any element for that matter, all the elements that are going to be displayed on the browser. Remember, we mentioned on a previous lesson that all the things that are to be displayed on the browser, they fall inside the body element. I'll touch more on the next lesson. Actually, in the next lesson, we're going to be learning about this structure, all these things that you have been seeing me writing lesson after lesson without explaining, the HTML tag, head tag, the body tag. We will get into the structure of an HTML document. Anyways, so inside the body element, all elements that are inside of it, including this H1 element, P element, whatever the element, they can have an ID attribute. But a specific ID, for instance, in this case, first underscore paragraph, that's a specific ID, should only be assigned to one element per document. In the same way that one person, for instance, in South Africa, we use ID documents, and each ID document has a unique ID number for an individual. So it's the same concept. You can't have then create, let's say we create another element, whether it's a P or it could be something else for that matter. You could say make this a div. I am the first div. It cannot have this same ID because this ID has already been used. So only this element can have this ID or this one, but they cannot both have the same ID. So if we wanted to have a ID, we could use some other ID, maybe first div or whatever we choose. So that's how the ID works, the ID attribute. Now an element can have more than one attribute. So which we will demonstrate by looking at the second type of attribute, which is also used to identify elements, but in this case, a group of elements as opposed to a single element, as is the case with the ID attribute. So this attribute is called the class attribute. So first of all, how do you specify more than one attribute? You simply add a space after your last attribute, and then you go and specify your next attribute. So let's say, for instance, in this case, class, we will call this, let's just call it class 1, because I'm lacking creativity juices in my head right now. Anyways, so class 1, unlike the ID, a specific class can be added into more than one element. For instance, this class 1, we can go and also edit in this element, and we can go and add it to another element. I'll say I am the second div, and then of course I have to change the ID because, as we said, we don't want a ID appearing in more than one element. But for the class, as you can see, these are 3 elements, but they all have class 1. Now, you use a class when you want to group elements together. So, for instance, in this case, class 1, that means these 3 elements, they have something in common. Whatever class 1 means, you as the developer, you define what class 1 means. So, in both the cases of the ID and the class, in and of themselves, they don't really mean they don't necessarily mean anything for the most part when it comes to HTML itself. The ID in particular, it does have a use. We'll touch on that use just now in relation to HTML, A tags or the link or hyperlink tags, which we'll touch on later on. We'll see how IDs relate or they work together with the A tag. But overall, other than that, especially as far as the class tag is concerned, they do not have a lot of functionality. Their functionality becomes more apparent when you start working with CSS, or when you start styling your HTML document. That's what we use CSS for. Now, when you style an HTML document, you may find that you may want to identify or style a specific element, and then you would assign a specific ID to that element, and then in your CSS, which we'll learn about later on, you would then be able to say, okay, for an element with this particular ID, apply this style. And in some cases, you may want to style a group of elements, and that's where the class would become relevant. So you would style, as we've seen here, we've styled all three of these elements with class 1. Say now we want to apply a specific style to all three of them. We don't want to go and create the same style for first paragraph, same style for first div, same style for second div. We just want to create one style called class 1 style, and in our CSS, and then when we create that class 1 style, all three of these elements would have that style. But I won't get into much more detail as far as that is concerned. We will learn more about that when we start learning about CSS. So that's our first. So let's quick recap. We've learned how an HTML tag attribute is written. Is the name of the tag of the attribute is equal to, and then in quotations, the actual value of that attribute. And furthermore, we've seen that you can have more than one attribute in an element by adding a space. And another thing, we've learned that you only add attributes in the opening tag. So we can't come here. Let me just put a space over here between these two elements. You can't come here now and start adding attributes, maybe adding attributes over here. We do not add attributes in the closing tag, only add attributes in the opening tag. Next, let's look at attributes that actually affect how a element appears and even functions when it's displayed on the browser. So to do this, we will turn our attention to an element or a tag called the input tag. It's actually it doesn't have a closing tag. It's a empty tag element. So input requires a attribute that is called type. So let's start off by specifying the type to be text. So now, unlike the previous two types that we've considered for unlike the previous two attributes that we considered, specifically the ID attribute and the class attribute, the type attribute has predefined values. So for instance, in ID, we said that you can specify any ID that you want. You could say Zooks for that matter, or whatever, and that would be a valid ID. So unlike that, when it comes to the type attribute for the input tag or the input element, there are predefined values. So there's a finite or a limited values that you can specify, which are already predefined. So you can't come here and specify whatever type that you want. So let's start with the text. If we come over here and we say F5, look at that. So it creates a text box that you can type on. And then if we quickly change it and say, let's say, for instance, we say button, and then we come here, refresh, it created a button. Now, typically when you are dealing with the button type, you would want to add another attribute, which is called value, which will specify what is to be written on that button. For instance, you'll say, click me. Click me. And there we go. And by the way, let's quickly add a BR element, which will create some space for us over here. Let's quickly change the type again and say, let's start by number. What does this number type do for us? Notice now there are two arrows. As you click up, it changes the number over there. Click down, it changes it. Let's change the type again and say date. Okay, let's remove the value attribute now. By changing the type to date, what does that do? Look at that. So you see how by changing the type attribute of the input, it actually changes how the element itself looks and how it actually functions. Next, let's consider attributes that are actually compulsory for a specific element. So to do this, let's imagine that our document is a little bit longer than what we currently have. So we'll just do this by adding a bunch of, shall we say, dummy P elements. Some paragraph element, and then we'll proceed to copy and paste it a bunch of times. All right, okay, that should be long enough. And then let's imagine that we have a h2 element that says chapter 1, and then it also has things under it. And then we have another h2 element that says chapter 2. Okay, and then let's add a little bit of stuff under it as well. Bunch of paragraphs. So both these h2 elements, let's give them IDs. The first one or rather the second one will give it an ID chapter 2, and then the first one will give it an ID which we'll call chapter 1. Okay, so let's say this is our setup. Now remember when we spoke a few lessons ago about link elements, which are by the way called A elements, using A tags, we spoke about how these are used to link to external resources or web pages, or used to link internally. So let's say we have two links. First one will say, I am a link, or shall I say, I am an internal link to chapter 1. And then the second one will say, I am an internal link to chapter 2. Now, if we come over here and refresh, no, oh, by the way, let me just do this. Let's add a BR element, which will just create some space between those two. Notice how there's actually nothing different about these two A elements. They look like your typical P or like your div element that we've seen. So what's the point? So that means that there's actually an attribute. Let me just create some space here. That means there's actually an attribute that's essential, or that's needed or necessary or compulsory for A tags or A elements, because after all it's a link. So the question is, to where is it linking? So that attribute is the href attribute. So in this case we are linking internally. So we want to link, remember we gave that h2, the first h2 element, an ID of chapter 1, and then we gave the second one the ID of ID. You always use, when you're saying ID, you use the hash symbol, by the way. So you're saying the ID of chapter 2. So now this link element should now be pointing to chapter 1, and this one should be pointing to chapter 2. Okay, let's check them out. Notice first of all the fact that now all of a sudden they actually appear like your typical link. So let's click on chapter 1. Look at that, it takes us to chapter 1. Let's go back, chapter 2, and look at that, it takes us to chapter 2. So we've now seen how certain attributes have compulsory or necessary, we've now seen how some elements or tags have compulsory or necessary attributes, without which then the element doesn't really make sense. You miss using the element if you do not specify that specific, or rather that required attribute, as is the case with the A or hyperlink element, which is the A element. And by the way, you can actually use a link, of course, not only to point internally, but to reference external websites or resources. For instance, let's say let's start by doing this. Say if we come over here and we go to YouTube and we come to my channel. So this is my channel URL. This extra part here in the end is not actually necessary. So this is my YouTube channel's URL.
Yo, ever wanted to become a web developer?
Keep quiet. So let's say I wanted to reference this in another website or in my website. I wanted people to have a link that would send them to my YouTube channel. So we would come over here and say h reference is equal to, and then actually specify the URL, and then close that, and then we'll say I am a link to, okay, let me just minimize this a little bit. I am a link to a YouTube channel. Save that, go back. I'm just going to close this. Let's refresh. There's the link. I am a link to a YouTube channel. Let's click on it. And there we go. Let me pause this before I start speaking. And there we go. So we saw that link sent us here. We can go back. There's the link. When we click on it, it's now taking us to an external website. Lastly, let's speak about custom or user-defined attributes. So sometimes you may find that you may want to add extra information to an element, not using the attributes that come with HTML, such as ID, class, hrefs, or type, etc. So whenever you want to add your own extra information to an element, we just create a space over here. You use the data dash and then specifying whatever else you want to specify. Then this then creates this is an accepted standard of HTML that is understood to say, okay, the developer is now creating their own custom attribute that they want to use to store extra information. So if, for instance, this particular paragraph I was using to say store a location, let me say location, say Cape Town, South Africa, for instance, and then I wanted it to also have a latitude, which is, I forget, is it 33 point something, I don't know, and then I also wanted to have a longitude, which is 18 point something. No, there's a minus somewhere, either there or there, I don't remember. So for instance, let's say I wanted to do something like this. That's when I would then use custom attributes. Custom attributes become more relevant when you start using JavaScript so that you can create an interactive website. That's when typically a developer would then start using custom attributes. So when we get to later sections where we start using JavaScript to actually create web applications or websites that have some interactiveness to them, that's when we'll start seeing us using custom attributes, which the format for them is data dash, and then you add whatever else you want to add, or you can make it longer, such as saying data dash something dash another. So you can keep on saying dash 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 if one word will not be enough for your specific attribute. So just to recap briefly, attributes are defined, or they are placed specifically on the opening tag of an HTML element. And on top of that, the format for attribute is you specify the attribute name is equal to, and then inside of quotations, you then add the value of that specific attribute. Some attributes are used to identify a specific element or a group of element, specific element in the case of ID, or a group of element in the case of, for instance, the class attribute. Some attributes are used to even change or change how an element looks, or even specify the functionality of an element, such as is the case in the input element with the type attribute. For instance, when it's date or when it's text or number, it will change how that element appears on the browser and how that element functions on the browser. Some attributes are necessary or they are compulsory. For instance, the href attribute for the a tag, because without this attribute, then the a tag, it wouldn't make sense for you to use an a tag. So those, in a nutshell, are attributes. Now, of course, I have not exhausted all the attributes that are available in HTML and how each attribute works. In order for you to have an exhaustive list of attributes, there's actually a web page that you can go to. On that website we spoke about that contains a lot of information, that documents a lot of information, pretty much all of the building blocks of exhaustively of HTML. So let me take you there. I'm also going to give you this link on the description so that you can take your time and peruse. So let's go there. So this is the website, developer.mozilla.org. As you can see here, en-us docs web HTML attributes. So when you come to this website, you will actually get an exhaustive list of all the attributes that are available in HTML. For instance, they even touch on the custom attribute, the one that we spoke of, data dash, and then whatever you want to specify. By the way, in programming, you'll get familiar with this star or asterisk. I think that's what that symbol is called. Whenever you see that, it just means many or all. So that means that this can be used to substitute like multiple values. Anyways, so let's you attach custom attributes to an HTML element. So they touch on all the attributes that are out there, and they tell you the elements that the attribute can be used in. For instance, let's look for the type. Where you so you see type. The input element is one of the elements where the type attribute is used, and you can see that there's a bunch of other elements that the way it can be used with. What else? Href, there you go. Then there's a bunch of other elements that use the href attribute. So spend time as you start. When you are done with this tutorial, give yourself some time to go to this web page and check out the various attributes that are out there, and become friends with this website, as it's essential now when you start digging deep and you want to learn more. Okay, and that brings us to the end of our lesson. Next up, we will learn about the general structure of an HTML document. Later, you can watch other tutorials over here, and most importantly, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so that you don't miss out on tutorials as they come out. Have you subscribed? Are you done? Okay, cool.